Hi guys, hope you are having a great day and don't have to deal with crazy mothers-in-law. First story I have for you today is about OP's mother-in-law who wants to wear OP's wedding dress to her own wedding. That's just weird. Enjoy the stories, guys. I got married to my soulmate 3 years ago, despite seeing a lot of red flags in his family, specifically my mother-in-law. She would constantly berate me with passive-aggressive comments about how I keep my house, my career choice, I am a chef, which is not her idea of a sustainable job, etc. My husband and his mother are very close with one another, and I normally bite my tongue as to not put him in a situation where he has to choose between her and I. However, something happened this past month that spiraled me. My husband's father passed away when he was 7, and since then, his mother has been a revolving door of different men, despite my husband urging her to settle down. Finally, she met a very nice man, and they got engaged. For timeline's purposes, my husband and I got married 2 months before my mother-in-law's boyfriend proposed. They were engaged for another 2 years before deciding on a wedding date. Shortly after the wedding date was set, my mother-in-law invited me to dinner, which was incredibly out of the ordinary, and asked me if I would be willing to lend her my wedding dress for her wedding. Needless to say, I was shocked. My wedding dress was made custom from a very nice designer, and it had been my dream dress for as long as I could remember. It is also important to note that it was paid for completely by my mother and I, and in fact, my mother-in-law did not pay for anything in our wedding, except for $200 towards our honeymoon, which I thanked her profusely for. So, for her to ask if I would lend her my $4,500 dream dress that she had no part in buying, that I had custom made for myself, seemed ridiculous. I gave her a polite no and explained to her that that dress was very sentimental to me and I would feel uncomfortable having someone else wear it. I didn't even mention anything about money. She threw a complete fit in the middle of the restaurant, going on about how she wished her son had married someone more grateful and giving than myself. She commented on how the dress doesn't even fit me anymore because I've gained so much weight. I had 2 children since then, and how it would be stupid of me not to give it to her. I excused myself from dinner and went home to tell my husband. To my surprise, it seemed like he was taking her side. He tried to reason with me that I would have no use for it anymore, so the nice thing to do would be to give it to her. I called my mom, who was furious. She called my mother-in-law and went off on her for even asking that, and explained to her how many extra shifts I had to pick up to even be able to afford that dress. My mother-in-law has since then disinvited both my mother and I from the wedding. I feel like I'm genuinely going crazy, so please, let me know. Am I an a-hole for not wanting to give my mother-in-law my wedding dress? Of course OP is not an a-hole. It's bizarre that mother-in-law would want to get married in OP's dress. This is something you would offer to your own daughter-in-law in the future. And since OP's husband doesn't understand that, OP should send it to her mom for safekeeping so she can't get her hands on it. Some backstory first. My mom has never made an effort to be friends with my wife. My wife has brought her coffee and flowers and invited her to hang out, and my mother always blows it off. My wife and I have also had issues with my parents since we got married a year ago. We got pregnant with our son, now 2 months old, pretty much right after our honeymoon. We were over the moon and love our son more than anything. We told my parents the night we found out, and they just weren't all that excited. The lack of excitement turns to lack of emotional support for the entire pregnancy. They never showed any interest in anything related to our son for the entire course of the pregnancy. And I got into a couple of huge fights with them over it over the 9 months. 6 weeks before he was born, we decided no one would meet him due to newborns not having an immune system, and my mom was furious. She brought it up every chance she could, how much it sucked for her, and she told her friends and co-workers whenever we were around that she wouldn't be seeing her grandson for 2 months. After our son was born, I immediately had to go back to work. So we decided to ask my mother-in-law to stay with us for a few days to help out my wife and I, and allow me to sleep before work as I work overnight. Obviously, since my mother-in-law was going to see our son, we asked my parents, who live in the next apartment building, 15 seconds away from us, to meet him, and they said yes, and we set a date for that Sunday, 3 days later. My wife and I called every day up to Sunday to figure out a time, and every day they said yes to seeing him. Well, Sunday rolls around, and my brother completely blows it off to hang out with friends, and my parents do the same. They say they're just so busy and that they had ballroom dancing classes for their upcoming wedding. The classes were not for 5 hours, by the way. After this complete blow-off of meeting our son, after all the other issues of the pregnancy, we decided to go no contact with them, which has been great. They're getting married in a few days, and my wife and I decided to be there as guests to support them when the plan was originally to be in the wedding party. Throughout our no contact, my parents have blatantly lied to my family about us asking for tons of money and paying our bills, and they victimized themselves as being so busy and having no time to be grandparents. They told my aunt they're disappointed because they were expecting to be grandparents for another 10 years at least. My dad also told us he has no interest in having a relationship with my son. As he is so young, he wouldn't remember it anyways. So we'll go as guests, but my mother still expects my brother and I to walk her down the aisle as her relationship with her dad sucks. I refuse to do it, after all the issues with our son comments to my wife over the year. Am I an a-hole for refusing to walk her down the aisle after all the events of the last years? OP is not an a-hole, but honestly, why is he even going at all? His parents, entire family, seem like very selfish people. They've told extended family lies to make them look better, which means OP is going to spend the entire night explaining his side and trying to correct them, and that doesn't seem worth the hassle to me. Update. They called us on the phone. We talked. Apologies and explanations were made on both sides. They came over and met our 2-month-old. He loved them, and they've been gushing over him for days. They came back the next day to see him again, keeping them at arm's length still emotionally, but hopefully meeting our baby was a good turning point for everyone. I, 35 female, have been together with my husband, 43 male, for just over 10 years, and married for 5 years. It is his life's dream to have children of his own, which I have known from the start. When we first got together, he was in the process of immigrating to a different country. We did the long-distance relationship thing once he moved, and he ended up proposing to me over Skype a few months later and asking me to also immigrate to be with him. I agreed and began the long immigration process to come over as a skilled worker. At that time, his parents had already immigrated, so he stayed with them until I landed several months later, at which point we moved into our own place just down the road from his parents. We come from a traditional Far Eastern culture where family is considered extremely important and parents most revered of all, although we were both born in what's considered a Western country. My parents had immigrated to my birth country a couple years before I was born, and my father was basically out of the picture very shortly thereafter. So growing up, it was just my mom and me. My husband, on the other hand, was surrounded by extended family growing up, and he considered a big family as very important. I tried to get out of my comfort zone and adapt, wanting to be a good daughter-in-law. But from the beginning, my then future mother-in-law began exhibiting strange behaviors. The most egregious boundary crossing involved our wedding. Future mother-in-law knew that we were engaged, but I suppose we weren't getting to the wedding fast enough for her liking, because I received a call from my mom in the middle of the night asking me why I hadn't talked to her about my wedding. I was flabbergasted and came to find a mass email that future mother-in-law had sent out to her entire family, dozens of people, my mom and me, informing me of my wedding date, venue, in another province, etc. The date was set for 2 months from the time the email was sent. I called future mother-in-law the next day and asked her why she didn't talk to me about this before sending out a mass invitation. She replied that it was the last time for years her whole family would be able to get together, so we had to have it then. This turned out to be false. I responded that all of my family and friends were in another country, and 2 months wasn't sufficient time for them to save up for what was essentially a destination wedding. She told me that if they couldn't afford to make it, then they didn't deserve to come. I was devastated, but my husband begged me to just agree to keep the peace. So we ended up having the wedding her way, although I knew practically no one there, and no one from my side could make it, not even my mom. From that day onwards, whenever she saw me, mother-in-law would ask me if I was pregnant. The thing is, my husband has a brother who's married with 2 kids, and he lives in another country. My husband has admitted that it was to get away from mother-in-law. And whenever they visited, mother-in-law goes out of her way to do exactly what sister-in-law asks her not to do with her kids. Her need to do things her way or the highway have become really clear over the years. For example, I planned a birthday lunch for my husband one year, and we and all the extended family in the vicinity took time off for it. Mother-in-law found out that I'd chosen the restaurant. She said beforehand what food she wanted, so I picked the restaurant based on her food preferences. And she walked in only to immediately say the place was unacceptable and walked out. She insisted on just getting Burger King takeout instead. I ended up crying in front of everyone and feeling awful for ruining my husband's birthday. Anyway, my husband has recently been talking more and more about having kids, but at the same time, we haven't actually been intimate in about 3 years. He would always say he was too tired, so stop initiating. Mother-in-law recently told me in the family WhatsApp group that I didn't know what I was talking about regarding something I definitely did know. And I ended up turning to my husband and saying that I don't know if I can have kids with him while she's still alive, as I know how much he values family and that it would be important to have her in the kids' lives. He told me that if that's the case, then he'll have to file for divorce. I love him and don't want him to leave me, and I know my biological clock is ticking, and if we don't try until mother-in-law is dead, it might be too late. He is an amazing husband in all other ways, extremely considerate, and makes me feel safe. Is there anything I can do to resolve this? It sounds like OP and her husband have a really unhealthy relationship that won't be solved by mother-in-law dying. These are facts. An amazing husband does not choose his mommy over his wife. OP did not ruin his birthday, his mother did. A good husband does not threaten divorce when you voice concerns over boundaries. The reality is, her behavior will not improve when OP and her husband have children. It will become far more egregious because she knows there are no repercussions. And OP's husband will allow it every time. If OP couldn't even plan her own wedding, she certainly will not have a say in how her children are raised. Every decision OP makes that she doesn't like will be overruled. OP should run away and not look back. She should consider this a learning experience and know that she deserves a man who places his wife first and sets boundaries for his mother. My husband has an ex-wife and 3 children. The ex tried everything she could to control us, and sadly, it worked. And yes, I know my husband should have stood up to her, but he didn't. She controlled where we went on vacation. She decided she didn't want me alone with the kids, who were older teens, so I wasn't allowed to be around them alone. She didn't like that the house we were looking at meant the kids had to share a bathroom, so we couldn't buy it. She didn't like that we planned a cruise for our honeymoon and excluded the kids. I could spout off 100 different ways she controlled our lives, but that would make this even longer. Unfortunately, about a year ago, my husband was in a bad accident while out of town for work. I drove the 5 hours to where he was, and his kids, with his ex in tow, flew down. Even then, the ex was trying to control everything. She tried to tell me her oldest child was the one to make the decision about DNR and what would happen to his body, and so forth. And I finally shut that down, after trying so hard to be nice and understanding. He passed away about midnight, and they left about 30 minutes later to go to their hotel room. I finally made it back to my hotel room a few hours later, and then of course didn't sleep much at all. About 7 a.m., I group texted the ex-wife and all 3 kids that we, brother-in-law and several other relatives, were all meeting at my hotel room at 11 a.m. to discuss his memorial service. The text message I got back was only from his ex, and she said that everyone was sleeping. Checkout times were noon at the hotels. As far as I was aware, no one planned to stay an extra night. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for them. Besides, the fact that there were other people that needed to leave as well. So we met at the designated place and time and discussed the memorial and put it all together. We did take into consideration the things his kids had mentioned the day before, like where they wanted the funeral held, and that his oldest had to leave in 2 days to go back to work. So we planned the memorial service for the place one of his kids wanted it to be at, and made sure that we would have it before his oldest had to fly back. About noon, I got a text from the ex that said everyone was up and that we were all meeting at 1 at a restaurant. I told her no, we already planned everything and everyone had left town and was headed back home. She flipped out. She said she and the kids should have been consulted and that brother-in-law and I were in the wrong for excluding the kids. I maintained that we didn't exclude the kids. We were on a time crunch only because of his oldest. We held it 2 days after he died so that his oldest could be there. His ashes weren't even there. We also held the memorial service where one of the kids wanted it to be held, and they were and still are always welcome to hold another service whenever they wanted. By the way, his children at the time were 17, 18, and 25. OP is not an a-hole. She tried to make it work, and the ex wasn't interested in doing it on OP's time. OP is his surviving spouse, and therefore OP makes these decisions, hard as they may be. Hopefully, now OP will no longer have to deal with the ex.